The transition off of fossil fuels is important and needs to happen, but it will affect the livelihoods of oil and gas workers and those in fossil fuel dependent communities. So how can we make sure the transition is just and people-centered?
Hello and welcome to Pullback, where we ask experts to explain big ideas so you get the full story behind the hype. Pullback is a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network of progressive Canadian podcasts. I'm Kristen Pugh, and I'm here with my co-host, Kyla Hewson.
On today's episode, we spoke with Hadrian Mertins-Kirkwood, a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Hadrian's work focuses on the social and economic dimensions of Canada's shift toward a zero-carbon economy, including the necessity of a just transition for vulnerable workers and communities across the country.
In this conversation, Hadrian explains the concept of a people-centered just transition and the challenges that Canada will have to overcome as we move away from fossil fuels. We also discuss the policies that are needed to help workers transition into new industries, including the need for green industrial policy. All right, let's do it. Can you talk a little bit about the term just transition and what it means?
Sure. Yeah. Just transition it's been around for a few decades now. It comes out of the labor movement. The kind of origins of a just transition are, you can trace back to like the 70s, but really as a popular concept, the term just transition really emerged in the 90s. And that was in the context of labor unions responding to environmental regulation. And it was sort of a progressive compromise on the part of the labor movement, an acknowledgement that yes, we need to take care of the environment. It actually, in the kind of pre-climate context, it was around, for example, like chemical regulations that were necessary, and that was going to hurt, some of the workers involved in chemical manufacturing. And they said, we don't disagree with the environmental policies, but as people bring these policies in place, need to also make sure that we're not leaving workers behind. So what can we do to support workers in that context? And that idea has been picked up in the climate context because we know that transitioning to a net zero economy, which we know is necessary, is going to transform the economy. And transformation can be good, but it also comes with a lot of costs. And in particular, just transition often focuses on oil and gas communities, oil and gas workers who are probably going to lose their jobs, or at least over the long term, we know those industries are in decline. So we need to make sure that we're not leaving those workers and communities behind. So that's really been like one of the big calls to action from the organized labor movement, especially in North America. And it was really formalized in 2015. The Paris Agreement acknowledged the, quote, imperative of a just transition. And that was a big milestone because once it was in the Paris Agreement, the government started to take notice. And now we see governments around the world using this just transition framing in the context of their climate policies.
Yeah, and the term just transition has become a little bit politically polarized as well, has it not? Can you maybe talk about some of the different understandings of the term?
Yeah, it's become politically polarized in Canada and almost nowhere else, which is interesting. So internationally, just transition is still the phrase. It's the phrase used by the labor movement. It's the phrase used by governments and activists and all sorts of actors, academics. In Canada, it's become very toxic. So the critics, I'll charitably call them critics of climate action, have basically associated just transition with kind of this concerted campaign to destroy the oil industry in Canada. And so the federal government has tried to move away from that framing. They've adopted the phrase sustainable jobs. It's basically the same thing. I mean, I don't like sustainable jobs as much because it downplays the transition part. And the transition part is necessary. It's not, we can't forget about the justice part, but we can't forget about the transition part. We need to move away from oil and gas. And the government is sort of afraid to admit that. But yes, it's become a very charged topic in Canada.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether you can explain as well sort of how the term just transition is linked to, some of the other transition-related terms people may have heard before. So things like a Green New Deal or in Canada, the LEAP Manifesto. Can you talk about like their relationship to just transition?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of overlap between those ideas. I would consider just transition a sort of a subset or component of a Green New Deal. And the LEAP Manifesto was, I think, more in that Green New Deal camp. And the idea behind those movements is really how do we build a sustainable, inclusive economy? How do we reimagine our economy in a way that's good for people on the planet? So that's really big picture thinking is the idea behind the Green New Deal. A just transition is a little bit more narrow. It's just about how do we make sure that workers and communities aren't left behind as we move from our current economy to a greener economy. And there's a variety of the kind of a spectrum of perspectives on just transition. So from the labor movement perspective, it's pretty narrow. It's like we've got a couple hundred workers in this coal plant. How do we make sure they have income support? That's the kind of narrowest end of the just transition spectrum. And then on the other end, the more kind of aspirational, maybe more kind of progressive and justice-oriented version of a just transition is, how do we bring more people into the fold? How do we make sure that as we're creating green jobs, that some of those jobs are going to women, to Indigenous workers, immigrants, racialized workers, people who have been historically excluded from the economy? So there's kind of a spectrum of what just transition can be, but I would say it all kind of falls underneath a bigger umbrella of something like a Green New Deal or more, I don't want to say palatable, more in the parlance of government, maybe an industrial policy. Just transition is part of that.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. So sort of different perspectives depending on who you're talking to, but fundamentally it's about bringing workers and communities along. I wonder if you could talk about some of the core policy elements or maybe the core principles or both in a just transition. What should it include?
Yeah, so this, again, it kind of depends on who you ask. So one that is universal, I think just about anyone would agree with in this space, is a voice for workers. So it's important that, and I say workers and communities, but actually we should be clear that especially within the labor movement where the just transition idea started, it's often just about the workers. And then it's kind of activists and academics who tried to kind of broaden the term and include others. But the idea basically is that workers and or communities should have a seat at the table. If governments are making decisions about the economic future of an area and of an industry, the people who are most impacted should have a say in how that unfolds. So that's one of the kind of core principles of a just transition. And you see that everywhere that just transition is adopted internationally in every context, about giving voice to those who are impacted by it. So that's really important. The next step I would say is like income support, a social safety net in general. It's basically the recognition that there are costs to transition, and we don't want workers to unfairly shoulder those costs. If we as a society decide that climate action is important, that we need to move away from coal, oil, gas, then we as a society should bear the cost, not just the people who work in those industries. And that's kind of where it ends, I think, for some activists or some advocates of a just transition. But I would say it's bigger than that. Another important principle, especially if we move into kind of the Green New Deal side of the discussion, we also need creation of new economic opportunities. So this is something I talk about a lot is, it's one thing to give workers a 12-month income top up and maybe a tuition credit or something. That's great. But then 12 months from now, if there's no new jobs in the community, it's a dead end. So it's not enough to provide social support if we're not also investing in economic diversification, which is something Canada has a troubled history of. And we haven't really done industrial transition very well in this country. And to the extent that we have done it well, we've usually missed that second part, which is, creating new jobs for people. And then a related piece that I also think is very important is workforce development, kind of generally speaking. And what I mean by that is a recognition that not only do we need to create new jobs, but we need to prepare people for those jobs. And we need to prepare both existing workers. We need to retrain people who are losing their jobs. And we also have to bring new people into the fold. I mean, the bottom line is when we talk about all the green jobs in the economy in the next couple decades, the vast majority of those workers will never have worked in oil and gas. It's kind of people like to talk about like getting the oil sands technician and retraining them to install wind turbines. And it's like, that's great. That's a small subset of the green economy. We need to train way more people. The people who are installing solar panels in 10 years are currently in high school in Mississauga. They're not oil workers. So we need to be doing this broader project of workforce development, making sure we have the skills and the workers we need to do the work we know needs to be done.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to emphasize. And I want to talk more about sort of that element, workforce development, and also green industrial policy in a bit. But first, I'm wondering if you can maybe give us sort of a sense of the scope and who's most impacted beyond sort of just, I think everybody knows oil workers probably going to be impacted, but how many of them are there? Who are they? Things like that.
For sure. That's at the center of the circle is right now it's coal workers. Coal workers are the center of the circle when it comes to just transition in Canada. There aren't that many of them. There's about, there actually aren't anymore. But when we started the coal phase out in Canada, there were about 3,000 workers in coal plants and coal mines. Roughly, it's actually quite tricky to measure some of these things because there's part-time workers and seasonal workers, et cetera, et cetera. But, on the order of, 3,000 to 5,000 workers and a few dozen communities across the country. The industry is very important to those communities, but to the Canadian economy on the whole, coal was not a super important industry. And then the circle gets bigger when we start looking at, for example, oil and gas. Now we're talking about maybe 200,000 workers across the country and a much more significant part of the economy. Much bigger sections of the country are dependent on the oil and gas industry. It's about kind of 5% of the Canadian economy, oil and gas, which is big, but not existential. But in a place like Alberta, it's a third of the economy is directly tied to oil and gas. So this is where, the costs of transition become more apparent is in places like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland, Labrador, where they really depend on the oil and gas industry. So those are the kind of obvious ones. And again, like 200,000 workers, that's significant. It's only kind of 1% of the national workforce. So at a country scale, we can very much manage this transition, but it's still a lot of people we're talking about. And then the next circle is the sort of indirect cost of transition. So ones that people don't really think about. If we move to electric vehicles, which are lower maintenance in general, that's a good thing in general for consumers. It's good for, we want to reduce emissions from internal combustion engines. But a lot of people work as auto mechanics right now. Even if we, retrain a lot of auto mechanics to work on EVs, we probably don't need as many as we have now. So these are the kind of indirect impacts, gas station attendants. It's stuff that we don't always think about as being connected to the oil industry, where there are potential costs or, transition risks moving forward.
And it seems to me like those indirect workers are probably more evenly dispersed across the country, but you had also highlighted the sort of point that some of these more directly associated fossil fuel industries, they're very regionally concentrated. Can you talk a little bit about how that makes policy challenging and sort of what approaches might be best given that?
Yeah, super challenging because you're right. When the costs are widely distributed, they're much easier to absorb. So that's why I worry less about, for example, gas station attendants, because first of all, even if we just have EV charging centers all over the place, people are still going to want to buy snacks and whatever. So, not all those jobs are disappearing. Yeah, it is tricky when we're talking about, most kind of significant example is Fort McMurray, Alberta. You've got hundreds of thousands of people working there. Almost the entire community is 100% dependent on oil, directly or indirectly. And it's like, how do you possibly save that community in a world where the oil sands are not producing? And there's not really an easy answer. You can't absorb that loss into the rest of the community's economy. Calgary can, but Fort McMurray can't. So that's one of the challenges regionally. It's not just a quantitative problem, but qualitatively, what do you do in a resource community that doesn't have that resource? So that's a problem, just kind of logistical side. And then the big problem from a policy side, or one of the big problems, is the issue between multiple levels of government. So whose responsibility is it when a coal town goes under because of a federal policy? That's really tricky. Is it the federal government's responsibility? Is it the province who's responsible for social services? Is it the municipality itself, which of course is, most directly responsible for its citizens? It's kind of all of them, but if you can't get all of those levels of government to work together or agree, which is the case when it comes to energy transition, it's really messy. And then I guess the last one I would just mention, I guess there's more, but another important one are the kind of cultural dimensions, where it's like, if you're a gas station attendant, you don't identify as being an oil worker. It's a job. Maybe it's a job you love and it's important to you, but it's not like your whole community is like, we are a gas station town. You're a town that does other things. But in a lot of parts of the country where oil and other natural resources are so essential to the economy, there is a really strong sense of shared identity around those resources. And so that adds additional political barriers and social barriers to making economic changes.
One thing that I think doesn't get talked about very much is sort of the way workers will be affected by the climate crisis itself.
There's a sort of tragic irony when we see especially oil sands operations shut down because of climate impacts, which has happened because of wildfires, but also because of droughts. This is an issue right now in northern Alberta and BC, which has got this significant drought, and fracking operations need tons and tons of water. That's how fracking works, is you got to produce a huge amount of steam and pump it underground. And if you don't have enough fresh water, you can't do that. That's kind of the immediate and ironic impact of climate. But yeah, the climate impacts are widespread, and especially for natural resource workers who are outside. Like that's the people who experience it most. Office workers, you just turn up the AC and close the blinds, right? Like it's easier to ignore the impacts of climate change. But for people working outside, natural resource workers, it's really, really direct. And we know that these impacts are getting worse across the country, right? The health impacts of wildfire smoke are significant. We don't really know, and it's hard to quantify what the costs are even now and what they're going to be. To the point of your question, workers have a lot to gain from this transition. And that's an important point that we need to be talking about more. That an oil worker who's, fly in, fly out of the oil sands, and especially, a migrant worker, maybe they're from Newfoundland or Nova Scotia. They fly out for 2 weeks, work in a camp, which is kind of notoriously terrible conditions, and then fly out. Like, what if you just had a job in your community, a clean job instead of having to work with oil in really challenging conditions all the time? So there's well-being benefits to moving away from that industry. And then, of course, the climate impacts are paramount.
So you've done some work sort of looking at like how much government should actually be spending in order to do what it takes for the transition. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Like how much really do we need to spend? How much are we spending? And where should we be putting that money to transition justly?
Yeah, so get ready for some big numbers because climate crisis is big numbers. Let's start with the costs of inaction, because I think too often when we talk about climate policy, we're like, it's going to cost X dollars. And then it's like the counterfactual is a scenario where we spend nothing on climate. And that's not actually true. Climate change is already costing the Canadian economy, in the range of $20 billion a year, $20, $30 billion a year. It's a lot of money, full stop. But that's something that we can absorb into our various provincial, federal, municipal, private budgets, right? But we know that based on the current trajectory of climate impacts, we're looking at that number reaching kind of $100 billion a year in the next 2 decades. Now we're starting to get into like, this is a big drag on the economy territory. And then there's research from the Canadian Climate Institute that suggests like in a worst case scenario, by the end of the century, we're looking at costs of around $1 trillion a year because of climate, especially extreme weather and disasters and heat, et cetera, et cetera. $1 trillion a year is kind of existential to the economy. Our economy doesn't work anymore when you're having to spend $1 trillion just cleaning up disasters. Like things just stop working. So that's the trajectory we're kind of on. And we need to look at that $1 trillion a year cost when we're thinking about what it costs to mitigate climate change. So on that point, we're currently spending somewhere around, again, it's like kind of hard to get specific numbers, but between the private and public sector, in the range of $20 to $30 billion a year on climate action. Again, you can quibble about what counts as climate action, but we're looking at like that ballpark, 20 to 30 billion, which is around what we're spending on climate disasters already, ironically. And that number is not slated to increase significantly. We don't have big plans to kind of quintuple the amount we're spending on climate, either publicly or privately. So the numbers there are pretty small. And then the last important number, so the first one is like cost of inaction. The second is what we're spending now. The third important number is what do we need to spend? And here there's lots of different estimates. One of the most common or popular benchmarks is 2% of GDP, which would be closer to $50 billion a year. But there's other estimates, including from the Department of Finance. In the federal budget, the Department of Finance says we need to be spending more than $100 billion a year on climate action. So let's just put those numbers in context. If we need to be spending $100 billion a year over the next 25 years, that's $2.5 trillion we need to spend to decarbonize the Canadian economy. We're currently on track to spend a fifth or a tenth of that. So there's a huge gap between what we're spending on decarbonization and what we know we need to spend to reach net zero. But I think it's important to remember, so we talked about this is like $2 to $3 trillion in total for Canada to basically meet our net zero targets versus a potential cost of $1 trillion every year, right, by the end of the century. So the costs are significant either direction. And I think that's one of the challenges of talking about climate is like, there's no way out of this that we don't spend a ton of money, but it's still going to cost us less if we make the hard choice now and spend the money up front to decarbonize the economy. And of course, that's something that every country has to do. And that's an important dimension of this as well.
For sure. So, these are big numbers, however we talk about it, but, inaction, as you pointed out, is much more expensive. But what are some of the specific things that we need to be spending on for this transition? Yeah,
well, the first thing that arguably, I don't know if it's the most important, but to me, it is an essential thing we need to be doing. And that's having a plan. And this is something that You can argue about whatever neoliberal impulses the federal government has, but governments in Canada are very afraid to make kind of prescriptive plans about where we want the economy to go. Right now, Canada is paradoxically arguing that we need to achieve net zero by 2050. That's our legislated goal. That is consistent with the climate science, net zero by 2050. And then also taking the position that we're going to be the last oil and gas producer standing in the world. And so we need to double down on oil and gas production with carbon capture or whatever, because that's the future of our economy. And those things are just fundamentally incompatible. We don't have clarity of vision for where the economy needs to go. So that's a big problem, because even getting aside what the federal government needs to spend money on, we also need to create the framework for the rest of the economy to spend money in the right places. And right now, if you're an investor, it's not obvious to you whether you should or should not invest in fossil fuels. And it should be more obvious that that's not a smart investment. Okay, so that's that piece. We just need a kind of clear vision for the future, a coherent plan for achieving net zero. So that's important. In terms of where we actually need to spend money, a big one is on electricity. Canada, we're lucky. We have a mostly clean electricity grid. It's like more than 80% non-emitting. Some parts of the country, like Quebec, are like 99% clean electricity. That's great. The problem is we need to double or triple the amount of electricity generation in the country to support decarbonization. And if this is one of those things that it's an essential input, because until we have enough kind of excess electricity, we can't decarbonize other parts of the economy. And that's why it's so important for government to intervene at like stages like this, where you're enabling the rest of the economy to come along with you. So yeah, we need a huge investment in clean electricity generation across the country. We're doing it, but we're just not doing it fast enough. We need probably 10 times as much investment in renewable energy across the country. Because once you have that, if you have an abundance of clean electricity, it makes it cheaper for industry to decarbonize, households, everything, right? So that's, to me, one of the highest priorities. And then the other is, and this one's a little bit messier, but it is economic diversification. I don't think it's my role or the federal government's role to decide how each region decarbonizes. Because, there's this kind of idea that we're going to take all of the fossil fuel communities and turn them into renewable energy communities. But we don't need to do that. We just need them to stop producing fossil fuels. And they could transition to agriculture, to manufacturing, to whatever, healthcare, like anything, as long as it's not fossil fuels. And so we need a lot of money from different levels of government to support this kind of expansion of alternative industries in the places that need it. So to me, that's another one of the kind of the big spends that needs to happen, is how do we scale up alternative industries? And we're seeing a bit of that with the government's, new investment tax credits. I'm a bit skeptical of how they've been rolled out, where it's kind of throwing money at the private sector and crossing our fingers and hoping that they make clean investments. I think we could be a bit more direct with that money. We need more of that active economic diversification.
I think I remember from your Spending What It Takes report, a big portion of the spending right now is subsidies to the private sector. Is that not the case? Is it that tax credit that's a big piece of that, or? That's
the biggest one. The federal government's single biggest spend on climate is its set of investment tax credits. And the idea is if you're a private company and you make an investment in an approved project, so renewable energy or some other kind of green infrastructure, clean manufacturing, we'll give you some variation of a tax break or, a subsidy to your production or whatever. But basically trying to encourage the private sector to invest in the clean economy, which is fine. We need the private sector to invest in the clean economy. The problem with this approach, there's a whole bunch of problems. One of them is that if the private sector doesn't bite, which has been the case historically, then nothing happens. So an incentive is not a plan, right? It's a hope. So that's one of the problems. And then the second is that often you end up just subsidizing or padding the profits of companies that would have made these investments anyway, instead of using the money to create new infrastructure or whatever in the public interest. So I have a lot of concerns about the approach of just being insufficient given the urgency of the problem.
Maybe we've already kind of started talking about this, but I wonder if you could talk specifically about what green industrial policy is and why we need it.
Yeah, well, so we've been kind of getting at that around the idea of economic diversification, and the Green New Deal is a version of green industrial policy. But the idea behind industrial policy in general terms is just kind of reallocating resources from one industry to another, trying to kind of shape the economy using public policy. And by that definition, every government does tons of industrial policy, right? They don't like to call it that, but every government does industrial policy. They favor some industries over others. And in Canada, we've historically had a pretty strong industrial policy supporting the oil and gas industry. So, buying the Trans Mountain expansion, this big oil pipeline is a good example of industrial policy. That's public money enabling that industry to grow. Now, of course, that's not green industrial policy. So green industrial policy is using these public policy tools to move resources from higher emitting to lower emitting industries. And that can take all sorts of forms, including public coordination and planning. Subsidies are part of it, but also direct public spending and regulations. So when Canada phased out coal power, that is a form of industrial policy, because you're basically saying you can't produce electricity with coal. We are regulating that you are going to have to produce electricity in other ways. And that reallocates investment into, unfortunately, it was into a lot of natural gas-fired power plants, but still lower carbon industry. So that's the idea of green industrial policy, is like, how can we reorient the economy around green industry? And for Canada, I mean, there's a lot we can do, and we're moving in the right direction in a lot of areas. Like in automotive is a good example. Like the auto industry is one of Canada's biggest manufacturing industries. They're one of our biggest export industries. And there's been a real concerted effort by multiple levels of government and the industry to move to battery electric vehicles. That's good. But we need that level of ambition in all kinds of sectors, and not just manufacturing, although that's a big one.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, maybe this is a good point in the conversation to talk a little bit about like equity in green industrial policy. Are there spaces that we could be spending more to have sort of like a greater impact on like lower income communities or vulnerable workers or other groups like that?
Yes, absolutely. And this all comes back to what we were saying earlier, this key idea of a just transition, which is like give voice to workers and communities. Because too often, I mean, this is the very clear kind of paternalistic tendency of the federal government to go into communities and say, this is what you're doing, this is what's happening now. I mean, of course, we have that in the context of Indigenous communities, but even today with cities across the country and different parts of the country, not feeling like they have control over their own communities. So that's really important. Is you got to start by talking to those communities, say, what kind of support do you need to do the kind of investment you want to do? So I'm going to start with a good example before I talk about a lot of bad things. The good example is that there's been a lot of movement in the last few years towards Indigenous communities, particularly rural and remote Indigenous communities, building their own clean electricity infrastructure. And to me, these are just win-win-wins, because it's like, first of all, a lot of these communities really depend on fossil fuels, especially if they're like diesel dependent. So to build renewable energy in the community is a climate win. Two, these communities are owning that infrastructure in many cases, which means it is now generating revenue for that community. And they're no longer, corollary that is they're no longer sending money to essentially kind of settler utilities. And then the third is that it also creates a whole bunch of jobs in that community. So it's like, these are great examples of like empowering communities to build clean infrastructure is just really good for those communities and for all of us. That's great. But we do a worse job of like looking at like the design of our cities, for example, and being like, how could we design our cities that would lower emissions and improve the well-being of especially like lower income or marginalized communities? And we do a terrible job of that. We don't incentivize building like low carbon, dense housing around functional public transit. Like there aren't a lot of good examples of that when you look across the country, compared to, Europe, of course, being the model of like, how do you build livable density that's transit linked? We do such a bad job of that in Canada. And it's a problem because like this, to come back to the equity question, like we're often thinking about like whether directly or inadvertently, like how do we enable like rich people to transition to lower carbon options? So we incentivize buying like Teslas and we don't invest the same amount of money into public transit. Or we provide, credits for homeowners to get new windows, and we don't provide the same support to, renters in buildings. So we're just like often not asking the right questions when it comes to equity. And then there's a whole separate issue that I mentioned earlier, which is like, how do you bring these communities into the fold in terms of creating jobs and opportunities for, historically marginalized groups in the clean economy? There's just so many dimensions to this that unfortunately are often not on the table.
Yeah, I am curious on the sort of giving a voice to community side. Are there models for what that should look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a start. When Canada was doing the coal phase out or starting the coal phase out, we had a task force on coal transition that went around the country. It went to not everyone, but most or many of the coal towns in the country, and how these kind of town halls where they met with workers and community members, listened to them and worked with them to kind of come up with what should the plan be? What kind of support do you need? And that kind of proactive engagement was a really great model that we haven't really done in the context of other transitions. But generally speaking, like, I don't know that we have a ton of great models are like large scale success stories. Like for sure, in like every community across Canada, I could probably point to examples of like community organizing that's been excellent, coming up with like, where do we want a community to go? But then often those kinds of initiatives don't have the support they need from higher levels of government, especially when it comes to like spending money, right? Like that's often the sticking point. Like municipalities would be like, that sounds great, but like we can't afford it. And they're often right. Municipalities are really cash strapped. So the provinces, I think, have to pick up the slack in a lot of these cases. It's tough to point to like really large scale success stories, unfortunately, on that front.
Yeah, fair enough. Maybe like, do you think it could look like something like citizens' assemblies or like
what could work is maybe a more interesting question. And I did write a co-authored a paper last year about, how can communities organize? And yeah, citizen assemblies are great. And like basically any forum that allows people to not only just like express their opinion, but like engages community members and works with them to be like, how can we come up with a shared path forward? So I mentioned earlier, like the importance of having like clarity of the federal vision, like, and it doesn't have to be complicated. It can be like by 2050, Canada is going to be a country that uses no fossil fuels. Most people have access to high quality transit in walkable neighborhoods. Can set these kind of high level objectives would be helpful. That has to work with community level plans. You need community level plans to say like, okay, let's look around here. What do we want our future to look like in the context of our community in a way that's consistent with this national vision, but is particular to our community, to the people who live here? And so I want to really encourage, more support, more institutional support and capacity for enabling that kind of grassroots community-led organizing. So you have this push from the top and a push from the bottom of planning for the future, which we just aren't doing a very good job of right now in Canada.
Yeah, I wonder if we can talk about, you had mentioned workforce development earlier. I want to go back to that a little bit. And I wonder if we can maybe start by talking about sustainable jobs. I know you mentioned you didn't like the term, but can you talk a little bit about what is a sustainable job or what term you'd prefer to use?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a question that the federal government has a hard time answering. They came out with a sustainable jobs plan and their draft sustainable jobs legislation, and it didn't define sustainable job. And then after a lot of pressure, they did put in a definition. The definition is okay. The problem is like the government's understanding of a sustainable job is like any job that can be part of a net zero economy, basically. And the thing is like any job can be. That basically doesn't rule out any job. So it's like really hard to know like what is a green job? Is it just a job that is like climate neutral? In which case we include a huge range of, for example, care work, healthcare workers, teachers. Those are green jobs because they're not actively, producing emissions, right? They're not harmful to the planet. Or do we have to be narrow and say a green job is someone who is like actively working to decarbonize? So then it's like solar installer or whatever. But it gets messy too if you think about like an HVAC technician. They install natural gas furnaces. They also install heat pumps. So it's like they're both part of the fossil fuel industry and that's a green job. So it's like really hard to define. To me, it's less about the workers and like trying to like classify professions, because we kind of need every type of work now and into the future, and thinking more about industries and to a lesser extent like technologies that we need to move towards, and then what workers fall under that umbrella. It's actually really hard to define a sustainable job. And that's why, frankly, actually, that kind of gets to my criticism of the term, where like just transition is like transition's happening. It needs to be just. We don't leave anyone behind. To me, that makes sense. Sustainable jobs is like we're going to create certain types of jobs. And like that kind of misses the point, because the phrase sustainable jobs doesn't capture the idea that we're moving from one thing to another. It's just about creating some types of work.
So maybe looking at it from a transitions perspective, what are some of the jobs that we're going to need and what sorts of workforce development could support them?
Yeah, well, I think the best place to start, it's a great question, is when we look at building retrofits. So retrofitting homes and buildings across the country is something we know we have to do. We need to improve insulation and we need to, take out all the existing fossil fuel infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a huge project. There's millions of buildings in the country. Many or most of them need to be retrofitted. And they're fully distributed across the country. So there's no shortcuts, right? You can't outsource home retrofits, really. You can't centralize home retrofits. Like we need workers in every community in the country who can install insulation, can replace windows, can do new roofs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's just an enormous amount of work. So that's a huge opportunity. Like, we know we need hundreds of thousands of additional building trades workers to do this kind of work. We don't have enough of them. And we know that the timeline, if you take someone who's like, I want to become a carpenter to the point where they can be like doing this work independently, is often around 10 years. I mean, there's all kinds of variables. But basically, we're like, we need to be planning 10 years in advance. If we like have this big plan for retrofitting, we need to start training a huge number of workers now to do it. And we're not really doing that. We're not really like connecting the dots between areas where we know we're going to have a lot of labor needs in 10 to 20 years and how many people we're training now. So this is why we need workforce development. We need to be able to forecast labor market needs 10 years in advance, get the right kinds of people in. And by right kinds, I just mean like new workers. And this is a great opportunity for us to address some of those equity issues. How can we do a better job of making these industries appealing to groups that have historically been excluded from them? This is something we do a bad job of. Like right now, for example, like if you want to become a skilled tradesperson in Ontario and you're a woman or an Indigenous person, like you can probably get a free ride. Like it's like highly subsidized in one way or another. And yet we don't see women and Indigenous workers signing up that much. And we don't see them completing this training. And we don't see them staying in the jobs as much once they complete the training. So there's all sorts of cultural barriers. It's not just financial. It's like there's cultural barriers to diversifying these industries that we're doing a poor job of addressing right now. So it's like, it's very complicated. But the main point is just that like, we know we're gonna need a lot of workers in some industries. We need to do a better job of training them now so that we're not all of a sudden 10 years from now saying like, we want to retrofit all these buildings and we just don't have enough workers.
One thing that I've been wondering about is, and I know you said it wasn't sort of like a one-to-one, we're not necessarily transitioning the same oil worker into like a renewable job, but one of the challenges is that like extractive jobs right now are like often they're very good middle class, often unionized jobs. Is there a challenge there of like getting people to transition, knowing that not all of these jobs are going to be like the high quality jobs that they've been relying on, or they're not going to pay at the rate that they've been paying?
Yeah, it's a big issue. And when you talk to the unions, because Canada, we're very fortunate in Canada that our labor movement is very supportive of climate policy, by and large. That's not true in many parts of the world. In many parts of the world, the labor movement is one of the biggest opponents of climate action. But one thing that a lot of the unions will tell you is like, how do we convince our members who are making $200,000 a year working in the oil sands to take a job making $80,000 installing solar panels, a non-unionized job making $80,000? And it's like, that's a really, really hard, if not impossible sell. So I think we need to kind of change our tactic. I mean, I think I mentioned earlier about how we can sell the well-being benefits of like, wouldn't it be nice instead of being this like fly in, fly out job in terrible conditions to just be able to be like to work in your own community, be home for dinner with your family every night. Those sorts of things that are kind of intangibles, but would actually make people better off, even if they're making less money. That's part of the kind of the sell. Part of it is saying we need to do a better job of unionizing, especially renewable energy, which is often not unionized. A lot of contractors are not. And then just generally asking workers, how do you want to do this? How do you want this transition to work? And there's groups like Iron and Earth that are doing that now, which is important. Because, and we haven't really talked about this yet, but ultimately the biggest driver of changes in the Canadian oil industry over the next 30 years are not going to be domestic policy. It's going to be global oil demand. In a scenario where the world is moving away from oil, Canadian oil sands is the first thing to go. If countries are like, we want cleaner fuel as we move towards net zero, oil sands are gone first. And so regardless of what the Canadian government does, like that industry is in trouble. We also need to think about framing this as like, it's not like we are choosing to eliminate your job. It's like your industry is in decline. What do you want to do next? And how can we help you? Because, for example, there are a lot of workers in the oil sands who are also ranchers. Like they own property and would like to do that. And it's like, great. If you want that to be your primary profession, what support do you need to work in the agriculture industry, essentially, commercially? Or there's going to be cases like the easier where it's like, oh, you're like a boiler maker. How do we transition you to working on wind turbine installation? What kind of transition training do you need and stuff like that? We're never going to succeed in just saying like, you should quit your job making a ton of money as an oil engineer and go make less money doing something else. Like that's not the right framing. I think we have to think of different ways of talking about this.
I'm wondering if you sort of had one key message that people would take away from this conversation. What would it be?
I think to answer that, I like a quote from a US group called Movement Generation. and I use it all the time, which is that transition is inevitable, justice is up to us. And I think that's really the most important takeaway. We can argue and fight about the specifics of climate policy, but the bottom line is by 2050, we will not be using and producing fossil fuels in anything like our current volumes. And so the question really is not whether we transition, it's whether we do it in a just way or not. And that is very much in our control.
How are you feeling, Kristen, about the possibility of Canada doing a just transition in the time needed?
Well, it worries me that we don't even really know what sustainable jobs means. That was something from the interview that really did concern me.
Yeah. What I'm finding with this season in particular is the amount of work that governments are not really doing still in just defining what we need. This takes so long, and we're not even at the first step, which is what is a green job?
Yeah, I think it's at the heart of the issue is we really need to come up with a genuine plan that will actually work rather than just paying lip service to these concepts. Because as Hadrian pointed out in the interview, if you don't have an actual plan, a sustainable job could be anything unless you have a clear plan. And so it really we're prevented from being able to actually make the policies that need to be in place in order for you to, first of all, define what is a sustainable job and what's not, and then to provide the transition supports that people need to get them out of unsustainable jobs and into green jobs of the future.
We really just need people in power who are willing to do the work and to get people, making the policies that we need. And that's not so hard. And yet it is really hard, especially in Canada, especially where green jobs is a very politicized phrase, which is also a frustrating situation to be in.
Yeah, but I think this points to the importance of organizing, which is something that we come back to a lot in this podcast, but it was something that I was thinking about as I was reflecting on the interview with Hadrian, because he did mention that. And it reminded me that we had also spoken with Anna Guerra of Iron and Earth, where Anna was really talking about some of the focus groups that they'd been through, talking to workers in Hinton, which is an Albertan community that's highly dependent not only on oil and gas, but also coal and other extractive industries like lumber. Iron and Earth's model is really cool because they're talking to people in extractive industries to try to get people in extractive industries to support a fossil-free future. And one of the points that she sort of reflected back as I talked to her is really that the terms just transition and the term climate change can be very polarizing at a surface level. But when you really dig beneath that, what people want is good middle-class jobs that have nice benefits. And so if we can have a transition that bears that in mind, you can actually bring a lot of people along with that. People want economic diversification. They want good paying jobs. And they really don't, in a lot of cases, care what the industry is. If the working conditions are good, if you're in a good unionized job, then people are going to be willing to move to that. So I think that's the vision we have to think about, is really making sure that people have what they need in the industries of the future, that we're not making people more precarious as we're transitioning.
That's a really good point in remembering why so many people do cling to these fossil fuel jobs so tightly. It's not that every single one of them is a climate denier or that they don't care about climate change or the way that the world's going to look in the future. It's that society has become more precarious over the course of our lifetime, certainly. And some of the very few jobs remaining that are middle class are fossil fuel jobs. And I think something that we could really do to spice up the economy is offer middle-class jobs at all that are let alone, it would be great if they were fully green, we're all installing solar panels or whatever. But even just investing in healthcare, education, just middle-class jobs. I don't know, I'm working in education right now and I can barely pay my rent. You know what I mean? That used to be a job where you could buy a house.
Yeah. And it's really, this is another point that, Anna in speaking to fossil fuel workers in Alberta, like one of the main things that she heard is like the salary is a big problem, right? Because if you are in an industry where you can, with a high school degree or even less, sometimes they don't even require that, you can work really hard for a couple of years and buy a house outright. Like, I think that's a pretty hard deal to turn down. One of the things that, I mean, Hadrian pointed this out in the interview as well, right? Like, one of the things that we really need to think about in transitioning is how we're making sure that there's quality jobs on the other side. One of the things that, like, you hear a lot in Ontario, this is something I really observed when I moved to Ontario from Alberta, is there's a lot of the progressive left really demonizes oil and gas workers. Which, like, I understand, like, we do need to transition off of fossil fuels. We need to keep it in the ground. And it is very frustrating to hear people who are sort of really defensive of the industry. But you have to consider on the other side, like, that there is economic security at stake for people. And, like, it's very, very hard when we're not giving them sort of a good menu of options on the other side. So I think we need more compassion overall. And we need a people-centered just transition, which is what Hadrian taught us all about.
Hadrian was fantastic, as you just heard. And if you are looking for more fantastic, progressive Canadian podcasts, you can check out the Harbinger Media Network for all of our sister shows. We are grateful to be learning and unlearning on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, as well as the ancestral unceded territory of the Anishinaabe-Algonquin Nation. We encourage listeners to visit native-land.ca to learn more about the history of their own territory and to read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action.